intense push toward what some political insiders are predicting could be an historic wave of black women elected to office. There has already been some progress. For the first time ever in 2018, the number of black women in Congress climbed above 20. And that's inspired hundreds of other black women to go into training to turn their significant voting power into political power.
Stephanie Rose Spalding doesn't see her unsuccessful congressional race as a loss.
You make phone calls, you knock doors when people slam doors in your face.
As much as practice. She's now one of a dozen Democrats running against incumbent Republican Senator Cory Gardner in purple Colorado, more aware than ever of what she's up against as a black woman.
What do people say to you?
You know where you're running? And I'm like, yes. Do you know that you're black? Every day.
What?
Yes. They ask that question.
The national Democrats have questioned you running.
Yes.
As a black woman.
Yes. Especially in Colorado.
It's a familiar story to the growing number of black women who are now learning how to run for office at training sessions spread over at least 20 cities last week alone. Grassroots groups like Vote, Run, Lead and Emerge, teaching them how to tell their stories.
I saw a lot of gang activity.
Build community relationships. And learn from successful candidates about the harsh realities facing black women candidates, like where to go to raise money.
I mean, they say, oh, call friends and family. Honey, my family didn't have any money. You know what I mean? So I went out, I put myself out there. I started meeting other women who were elected already, particularly women of color.
What are you worried about as a black woman if you decide to run?
Support from people in the community. Are like, am I competent enough? Am I articulate enough?
Just because you're a black woman?
Just because I'm a black woman.
These women are painfully aware they're bucking a system where black women are courted for their votes, but hold just 1% of U.S. Senate seats, 4% in the House, even less in state legislatures. And there's never been a black woman governor in any state. But this past weekend alone, more than 200 black women were preparing to run. And some wins in 2018, even the near wins, have been motivating.
I'm originally from North Carolina. There is some unspoken rules that are caps, that are glass ceilings for people of color.
So black women don't run for office.
They don't. So when you see Stacey Abrams breaking that glass ceiling and doing it unapologetically, that is amazing.
Part of the reason that I want to be able to run is so that people that look like me have some representation at that table. I am so tired of begging for a seat at the table, because that's what I feel like I've been doing my whole life. So I'm done begging. Don't give me a seat at the table. I'm going to bring my own table, my own chair, and I'm going to have a seat.
Joining me now, former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, Basil Smikle, and Democratic strategist and fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics, Aisha Moody Mills. So when you hear some of these women say there are unspoken rules, Aisha, for women of color, that she's asked, do you know that you're black? Is there anything you heard that surprised you?
Yeah, so when I was the president and CEO of the LGBTQ Victory Fund Institute, we did a lot of trainings. We helped people run for office. And you'd be surprised, just the sheer ignorance that I won't even call overt racism, because it's just not knowing that people have around candidates of color, and certainly around black women. I really appreciate the fact you've done this, Bucket. It actually just made me so excited to sit here and to just watch this.
Talking to them, and we went to several different trainings. The one thing about these women is they're not going into this blind. They have a really good understanding. For example, that black women are told it's not your turn, it's not your time, it's not your place, meaning you don't live in the right area, meaning you don't live in a black majority area. They saw that Lucy McBath won in a predominantly white area. They saw that Ayanna Pressley beat a longtime white male member of Congress. What's the lesson in here, Basil, for the Democratic Party?
Well, there are a few things in here, and history is actually important, because this is not just about political campaigns. Audre Lorde talked about this. She said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And what she was doing was challenging white women with their own racism and homophobia. My colleague at Teachers College, Lisa Edstrom, just did this great piece about and research about how black moms are always discounted in education activism, where the act of black parenting itself is an activist message. So I think what you're seeing is a lot of women sort of creating their own coalitions. They're not using the Democratic Party necessarily as the platform. They're using it as a vehicle and sort of rewriting political pathways.
But the way Stephanie Spalding put it to me was they've got to stop being the Democratic Party of the 50s because they're using these traditional statistical models that don't apply anymore. When you look at the women who shocked us and got elected, they're not the people who would show up in those models or would get the money from the DNC.
Like Johanna Hayes, for
That's
example,
right.
who just won Congress, and she was not the person in the primary that anybody even wanted to run, let alone who people thought were going to win. I think the other point of this, too, and Basil's so right, by changing the mold, by saying we're going to use our own resources and find our own people, what black women proved, what Stacey Abrams in particular proved by not winning but coming closer than any other Democrat in that state for governor in a generation, is that the excitement and enthusiasm is there, and that there are white people who do want to elect black women too. There's been such a myth that black women should only run when other black people are going to vote for them. And now we're seeing more and more people who are actually running and galvanizing the entire base of the party, but of people who don't see themselves as part of any party. And that's the lesson there.
One of the 4 women who I sat down with, who were part of a training that is, by the way, 6 months long, they have committed to a weekend a month to do this. And some of them not even sure what they're going to run for. But they talked about walking into a room and seeing other people who look like them. And one of the very young women said, you know, at one point I was so overwhelmed, I had to go outside and cry. Another woman who has run before was the one who came out, let me have her shoulder, but also her wisdom. It's about, as she put it, the sisterhood.
It's all about the sisterhood. And the fact that there are mentors right now and models. I mean, I used to work for the Congressional Black Caucus's PAC 15 years ago.
And by the way,
there were only a
CBC
handful.
was also doing training this weekend, I should say that.
There used to only be a handful, and that sisterhood had to be tight because when you only had, you know, a sorority of 7 or 8 or 10 of you, you had to be close and connected. And so now what's happened is that that's duplicated all over the country in state legislatures and otherwise. And the power of that network for the emotional stability of the people who are running in very, very, very tough races. People are calling them everything but a child of God. The type of personal attacks and ridicule, especially as a woman generally, and then as a black woman that you undergo by being in the public is really tough. And so I want to highlight that because having the emotional support and nurturing is actually strength. It's not a weakness. It's actually the strength and why these women can go on and be successful.
There's also the question about money. And I saw the article in the New York Times today that CEO pay increased at almost twice the rate of ordinary wages, and that Elon Musk's pay went up so much they had to redraw the graph. But you talk to women of color and they say, look, we're not in the circles where we have, my family can't write a $50 check or a $100 check, that they have not been brought into the regular systems. And yet, to some extent, there are other ways to raise money through Act Blue, where people can contribute and you don't have to have a lot of infrastructure and those kinds of things. But that's the other thing that the party doesn't really control anymore and that isn't taken into account. That people just have success on the basis of their own ideas and their own personality.
That's right. And I have a lot of friends, African-American women, that actually doing very well as C-suite coaches, not just to, number one, get more women in the corporate suite, but also how to use that power to be stronger activists in donating and other forms of activism. And going back to a point you made earlier about polling, 3 women trained me in politics. Hillary Clinton was one, but 2 African-American women trained me in politics. One has sadly passed away. But I think what's important about what I went through is that seeing them in positions of power taught me not to use their race or gender as something that was disqualifying. And so when you're creating assumptions for polls, for turnout models, those things become really, really important when you're not disqualifying those characteristics.